June 29, 1974. A quiet apartment in Aumühle near Hamburg, West Germany. The afternoon light filters through lace curtains as an elderly man sits at his desk, hands trembling slightly as they grip the edges of a book. He is 83 years old, a man who once commanded the most technologically advanced submarine fleet the world had ever seen, a man who briefly held the title of Führer of the Third Reich in those chaotic final days of May 1945. Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of the wolfpack tactics that nearly starved Britain into submission, now stares at page 117 of a volume titled The Ultra Secret, freshly arrived in German bookstores. His aide translates the English text aloud, and with each sentence the blood drains from the Admiral's weathered face. From May 1940 onwards, the passage reads, we read the German naval, army, and air force traffic almost as quickly as the Germans themselves. For 30 years, Dönitz had lived with his explanations for defeat: Allied radar superiority, overwhelming material resources, technological advantages in detection equipment. Now, in a single afternoon, those explanations crumbled to dust. Every order he had transmitted to his U-boats, every tactical innovation he had devised in those subterranean command bunkers, every desperate attempt to turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic had been read by British intelligence, often before his own commanders received them. The encryption system he had trusted with absolute, unwavering faith had been systematically compromised since 1941. 783 submarines lost, 30,000 of his men dead beneath the cold Atlantic waves. And all because the mathematical certainty that protected Enigma had been an illusion. This is a story about the greatest intelligence triumph and the most catastrophic intelligence failure of the Second World War. It's a story about brilliance and blindness, about the courage of codebreakers working in secret, and the tragedy of submariners sailing into traps they never saw coming. It's the story of how an entire nation, led by some of the finest military minds of their generation, remained utterly, fatally ignorant of a compromise so total that it shaped the outcome of the war itself. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary chapter of World War II history, if you're fascinated by these untold stories of the Second World War, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Now let's step back to understand how this catastrophic blindness could have happened. The foundation of German confidence in their communication security rested on mathematics that seemed, quite literally, unassailable. The standard three-rotor Wehrmacht Enigma machine, the workhorse cipher device deployed across every branch of the German military, offered 17,576 possible rotor positions. Multiply that by the 60 possible rotor arrangements, and you reached over 1 million primary configurations. But the real security came from the plugboard, that ingenious panel at the front of the machine, where cables could be inserted to swap letter pairs before and after encryption. The plugboard alone offered 150 trillion, 738 billion, 274,937,250 possible combinations. When you combined rotor positions with plugboard settings, the total number of possible configurations reached an astronomical 158 trillion, 962 billion, 555 million, 217,000, 826 million, 360,000 possibilities. To put that in perspective, testing every possible setting, even if you could test one per second, would require longer than the age of the universe. Dr. Erich Huttenheim, who headed the WWII, the Wehrmacht's cipher department, understood the theoretical possibility of breaking Enigma through mathematical analysis. He was no fool. In post-war interrogations, he would tell Allied investigators that he had considered the scenario carefully. But as he explained, he found it impossible to imagine anyone going to the immense effort required. This wasn't mere arrogance. It was a carefully calculated assessment based on the technology and resources available in the 1930s and early 1940s. By German calculations, testing every possible Enigma setting would require teams of trained cryptanalysts working continuously for periods that exceeded any reasonable wartime timeframe. Even if the Allies possessed captured machines, They would still need to solve each day's settings anew, because the keys changed daily at midnight Berlin time. German mathematicians calculated this would require thousands of trained operators working around the clock, an investment of human and material resources that seemed absurd for what was, after all, just one intelligence source among many. The Kriegsmarine took additional precautions that seemed to guarantee absolute security. Admiral Dönitz had instituted the most stringent cryptographic protocols in the German military, far exceeding even the Luftwaffe's procedures. Naval Enigma operators received specialized training at the Marine Nachrichtenschule in Flensburg-Mürwik, where they spent months learning not just the technical operation of the machines, but the security procedures that would supposedly make the system impregnable. The training was rigorous, almost ritualistic. Operators learned to destroy materials at the first sign of capture, to verify rotor settings 3 times before beginning transmission, to never repeat message keys, to vary message lengths and transmission times, to defeat traffic analysis. Codebooks were printed in water-soluble red ink on pink paper, specially formulated to dissolve within 30 seconds of water contact. Special weighted bags ensured the materials would sink immediately if thrown overboard. U-boat commanders carried personal sidearms with standing orders to shoot any crew member who failed to destroy cryptographic materials when capture seemed imminent. This was not an idle threat. The death penalty for compromising communication security was real and had been carried out. The introduction of the 4-rotor M4 Enigma machine for U-boats on February 1, 1942, represented what German naval intelligence considered the ultimate evolution in cryptographic security. The standard 3-rotor Enigma had been challenging enough, but the M4, codenamed Triton by the Germans and Shark by Allied cryptanalysts, took complexity to another level entirely. With 8 rotors to choose from, compared to 5 for other services, and that crucial 4th rotor adding another factor of complexity, the number of possible configurations increased by a factor of 26. The machine was heavier, more complex to operate, required more careful maintenance, but German naval cryptographers considered it worth every additional ounce of weight and every extra second of operation time. This was the cipher that would protect the Battle of the Atlantic, the campaign that could win or lose the war. To test their own security, German cryptanalysts at B-Dienst, the German Naval Intelligence Service, conducted their own penetration attempts. The 100-day project, as it was called, involved 3 separate teams attempting to break their own naval cipher, using every known cryptanalytic technique available to German science. They had the advantage of knowing the system's structure, understanding the daily key distribution procedures, and having access to unlimited plaintext and ciphertext pairs for analysis. For 100 days, the best mathematical minds in the Kriegsmarine attacked the M4 Enigma from every conceivable angle. All 3 attempts failed completely. Not a single day's traffic was successfully decrypted. Vice Admiral Erhard Mertens reported to Dönitz with complete confidence, "Our cipher does not appear to be broken, and on the basis of current knowledge cannot be broken." Dönitz took this assessment and built his entire operational strategy around the assumption of secure communications. His revolutionary concept of centralized tactical control, directing wolfpacks from headquarters via detailed radio messages, depended absolutely on the enemy not being able to read those messages. Had he known the truth, the entire German approach to submarine warfare would have required fundamental rethinking. Yet throughout 1941 and 42, inexplicable patterns began emerging that should have triggered alarm bells in German naval intelligence. Each incident was explained away, attributed to British radar, superior reconnaissance, signals intelligence derived from direction finding rather than code breaking, or simple operational bad luck, anything except the possibility that Enigma itself had been compromised. The systematic destruction of German supply ships in the spring of 1941 represented the first major warning sign that went completely unheeded. Between March and June of that year, the Royal Navy intercepted and destroyed 7 of 9 German supply vessels stationed in remote areas of the Atlantic to refuel and resupply surface raiders and U-boats. These weren't ships traveling predictable routes or operating in heavily trafficked areas. They were positioned in locations so remote, so carefully chosen, that chance discovery seemed statistically impossible. The Bletchley, positioned 300 miles north of the Azores, was discovered on March 3rd. The SO Hamburg, hidden in a remote bay chosen specifically for its isolation, fell on March 5th. The Egeland and Nordmark followed in quick succession. Each ship's position had been transmitted via Enigma to the submarines and surface raiders that depended on them. Each position had been chosen for maximum concealment. The probability of British patrols accidentally finding vessels in millions of square miles of empty ocean approached zero. Basic probability mathematics should have raised questions. Yet when Kapitän Ludwig Stummel of B-Dienst investigated these losses, his report concluded that British success must be attributed to improved radar technology and systematic ocean surveillance patterns. The possibility that the British were reading German position reports remained unconsidered in the official investigation. The file was closed with a note: "No evidence of cipher compromise. Enhanced Allied detection capabilities provide sufficient explanation." The destruction of the Bismarck in May 1941 should have raised even more serious questions. Germany's most powerful battleship, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was hunted down with uncanny precision after breaking into the Atlantic. The British seemed to know exactly where to search, exactly when to position their forces, exactly how to concentrate overwhelming naval power at the right time and place. When Luftwaffe General Hans Jeschonek received reports that British aircraft seemed to anticipate Bismarck's movements, positioning themselves to maintain contact despite vast expanses of ocean and frequently poor visibility, he dismissed subordinates' security concerns with crushing certainty. "It is impossible that the enemy is reading our ciphers," he declared at a staff meeting. "Our specialists have established this beyond doubt." The investigation focused on fuel consumption calculations, on whether Bismarck's captain had made tactical errors, on whether British reconnaissance aircraft had gotten lucky. The simplest explanation, that the British were reading every German naval message about Bismarck's position, intentions and damage status, never seriously entered consideration. But nowhere was the hidden catastrophe more evident than in the Battle of the Atlantic itself, that grinding war of attrition that would ultimately determine whether Britain could survive. U-boat losses began climbing steadily from late 1941 onwards, despite tactical innovations and technological improvements that should have increased their effectiveness. Dönitz noted in his war diary entry for January 12, 1942, his mystification at the interception of supply submarine U-459 in an impossibly remote location 800 nautical miles west of Freetown. The position was known only to U-boat command and the submarines scheduled for refueling, he wrote. How did the enemy locate this rendezvous? His inquiry to Berlin brought the standard response from naval intelligence. An insight into our cipher does not come into consideration. Enhanced signals, intelligence, and direction-finding capabilities provide sufficient explanation. The statistics told a story of systematic destruction that defied conventional explanation if you looked at them with fresh eyes, without preconceptions about Enigma's security. In 1941, Germany lost 35 U-boats. In 1942, despite adding the fourth rotor to Enigma machines, creating what German cryptographers believed was an unbreakable enhancement to an already secure system, losses climbed to 85. By 1943, they reached catastrophic proportions. 237 submarines destroyed in a single year. May 1943 alone, Black May, as German submariners came to call it with grim fatalism, saw 41 U-boats sent to the bottom, representing over 1/3 of all boats at sea that month. These were experienced crews, commanded by veterans who had survived multiple patrols, men who knew every trick of submarine warfare. They were being destroyed at a rate that exceeded Germany's ability to replace them. Yet German analysts consistently found alternative explanations for every loss. When convoys began taking seemingly impossible evasive actions, avoiding wolfpacks with uncanny precision, sometimes altering course just hours before U-boats reached their intercept positions, Dönitz blamed Allied aircraft equipped with new radar systems. When U-boats were caught on the surface with disturbing frequency, often while charging batteries at night under conditions that should have made them nearly invisible, German scientists theorized that the British had developed radar capable of detecting submarines at ranges up to 60 nautical miles. This was a technological impossibility, given the radar technology of the early 1940s, but it seemed more believable to German minds than cryptographic compromise. The alternative, that Enigma had been broken, was simply too terrible to contemplate. It would mean that every operational decision made over the past 2 years had been transparent to the enemy. It would mean that the entire German strategy in the Atlantic was fundamentally compromised. The psychological barriers to accepting such a reality proved insurmountable. The mounting losses triggered increasingly desperate investigations by German intelligence, each more thorough than the last, each consuming more resources and involving more senior personnel, yet all suffering from the same fundamental blind spot: the unshakable assumption that Enigma remained secure. This assumption wasn't questioned. It was the foundation upon which every investigation was built. The most telling investigation began after the capture of U-570 by the British on August 27, 1941. The submarine had surrendered to a British Hudson bomber after suffering depth charge damage south of Iceland, potentially intact with all its cryptographic materials. This was precisely the scenario that German security protocols were designed to prevent. Kapitän Ludwig Stummel of B-Dienst was assigned to investigate the security implications, and his investigation was genuinely meticulous. He interviewed survivors who had been repatriated through prisoner exchanges, analyzed the submarine's last messages, reconstructed the probable timeline of its capture, and assessed the likelihood that cryptographic materials had been destroyed according to protocol. Stummel's October 1941 report revealed the cognitive trap that would persist throughout the war, a trap built from logic that seemed impeccable, but rested on false assumptions. He acknowledged that if the British had captured the Enigma machine and codebooks intact, they could theoretically read German naval traffic, but he immediately dismissed this possibility with reasoning that seemed airtight. Even if the British possessed the machine and current keys, they would lose this capability when the keys changed on November 1st. Furthermore, proper protocol demanded the destruction of all cryptographic materials, and it must be assumed that the crew fulfilled their duty. U-570's captain had reported initiating destruction procedures before surrender. British acquisition of complete materials seemed unlikely. Even if they had acquired them, the intelligence value would be temporary and limited. The acute disquiet about the compromise of our secret operation cannot be justified, Stummel concluded. Our cipher does not appear to be broken. What Stummel couldn't know, what no amount of meticulous investigation could reveal without questioning the fundamental assumption of Enigma's security, was that U-110 had been captured intact 3 months earlier, on May 9, 1941. The boarding party from HMS Bulldog, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Baum, had found the submarine's radio room completely undisturbed. Codebooks were spread on the table. The Enigma machine was still warm from recent use. The German crew, abandoning ship in panic after depth charging, had failed to carry out destruction procedures. Among the captured materials were the settings for high-level, officer-only signals and the short signal codebooks, Kurzsignale, that revealed how Germans compressed messages to defeat Allied direction-finding efforts. The British had captured not just a machine, but the complete operating procedures, the daily keys, the tactical codes, everything needed to read German naval communications. And they had done so with such perfect operational security that the Germans never knew it had happened. The British sank U-110 after the boarding operation, ensuring no survivors could report that the submarine had been captured rather than destroyed. The entire German investigation of communication security after U-570's capture was built on incomplete information, analyzing the wrong incident while the real compromise remained invisible. The investigation that should have exposed everything came in spring 1943, prompted by the catastrophic losses of Black May. Admiral Dönitz, desperate to understand why his wolfpacks were being systematically destroyed, despite technological and tactical superiority in many respects, ordered the most comprehensive security review of the war. He wanted answers. His men were dying at unsustainable rates. Something was fundamentally wrong. The investigation team, led by Korvettenkapitän Meckel, explored multiple hypotheses with impressive thoroughness. This wasn't a cursory review. This was a full-scale security audit involving technical experts, operational commanders, signals intelligence specialists, and cryptographers. Their first theory involved the METOX radar warning receivers carried by U-boats. These devices were supposed to detect Allied radar emissions, giving U-boats advance warning to dive before being caught on the surface. German scientists hypothesized that these METOX devices might be re-radiating signals that betrayed submarine positions. It was an elegant theory. If the receiver itself was transmitting, it would explain how Allies were finding U-boats with such consistency. A Focke-Wulf 200 Condor aircraft, equipped with detection equipment, was dispatched to test this hypothesis. The tests confirmed that METOX emissions could indeed be detected at ranges up to 110 kilometers under ideal conditions. The solution seemed obvious. Cease using radar detection equipment immediately. All U-boats received orders to shut down their METOX receivers. Dönitz waited for losses to decline. They didn't. If anything, they increased. U-boats without radar warning were even more vulnerable, caught on the surface without any advance warning of attacking aircraft. The investigation moved to the next theory, each more elaborate than the last. Perhaps the Allies had developed infrared detection systems capable of spotting the heat signatures of submarine diesel engines. This seemed possible. German naval technical departments launched a crash program to develop special infrared-absorbing paint. U-boats returning from patrol were hastily repainted with this experimental coating, which was supposed to mask their thermal signature. Crews complained that the paint reduced underwater speed slightly and required constant maintenance, but if it saved lives, it was worth the inconvenience. Still, the losses mounted. The breakthrough seemed to come when a crashed RAF bomber near Rotterdam yielded an intact H-2S radar system on February 3, 1943. German scientists who examined the captured equipment were stunned to discover the British had developed centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths around 10 centimeters, that their METOX detection equipment couldn't receive. This was a genuine technological surprise. German radar development had focused on longer wavelengths. The British had leapfrogged German technology. This revelation triggered another crash program to develop new detection gear, with the first Naxos radar detectors reaching U-boats in September 1943. Finally, Dönitz thought, we understand how they're finding us. But the new detectors didn't solve the problem. Losses continued. Convoys still evaded wolfpacks. Supply submarines were still caught at remote coordinates. Something else was happening. Something the Germans couldn't see. Throughout these investigations, one hypothesis remained notably absent from serious consideration. The possibility that Enigma had been broken seemed to have been placed in a category of impossibilities, examined briefly at the start of each investigation, and then set aside. As Admiral Erhard Mertens, head of the Naval Intelligence Service, reasoned in his 1941 assessment, breaking Enigma would require a perfect chain of unlikely events: the capture of machines and current keys, the solution of complex security procedures, the breaking of officer-only signals that used enhanced settings, and sufficient time for cryptanalysis before keys changed. He concluded these requirements were, taken singly, unlikely, and taken together, impossible. The mathematical improbability approaches certainty, his report stated. Resources required for continuous cryptanalysis of our naval traffic would exceed any rational intelligence allocation. This assessment was copied, referenced, and repeated in investigation after investigation. It became institutional dogma, the unquestioned foundation of all security analysis. Paradoxically, Germany's own success in breaking Allied codes reinforced their faith in Enigma's security, creating a false sense of understanding about the cryptanalytic battlefield. B-Dienst, the German Naval Intelligence Service, had achieved remarkable success penetrating British naval ciphers, and this achievement convinced German leadership they understood the game being played. They knew how hard codebreaking was. They experienced the frustrations, the blind alleys, the months of effort that yielded nothing. Kapitän zur See Heinz Bonatz, who led B. Dienst's English language section, had broken British Naval Cipher No. 3, used for convoy communications. By December 1942, his team was reading 80% of intercepted British convoy messages, often within hours of transmission. Wilhelm Tranow, Germany's most gifted naval cryptanalyst, could predict convoy movements 10 to 20 hours in advance, allowing U-boats to position themselves perfectly for intercept. This was a genuine cryptanalytic triumph, requiring brilliant mathematical analysis and enormous effort. This success created a dangerous psychological dynamic that would plague German intelligence throughout the war. German naval intelligence officers reasoned that if breaking codes required such enormous effort, such specialized talent, B. Dienst employed over 5,000 personnel at its peak, then surely the British faced similar or greater challenges attacking Enigma. They knew from experience that even with captured codebooks, maintaining continuous access to enemy communications required constant vigilance and frequent failures when codes changed. British codes changed regularly, sometimes defeating B. Dienst analysis for weeks at a time before the German cryptanalysts fought their way back in. What they failed to recognize was that, while they celebrated reading British convoy routes, tactical information of genuine but limited value, the British were reading virtually everything else. U-boat positions, patrol orders, supply arrangements, tactical innovations, strategic assessments, even Dönitz's personal communications sent to Hitler. The Germans were winning tactical intelligence victories while losing the strategic intelligence war entirely, but their tactical successes blinded them to the strategic catastrophe unfolding in the shadows. The supreme irony came in spring 1943, when B. Dienst's success actually accelerated German defeat in ways that would only become clear decades later. Reading British convoy communications, Tranow could position wolfpacks with perfect precision. He knew exactly where convoys were heading, when they would arrive in specific grid squares, even which merchant ships carried the most valuable cargo. But the British, reading both German positioning orders and their own compromised communications, knew exactly where the U-boats were gathering. They could see the trap being prepared. The solution was elegant and devastating: route convoys around the wolfpacks, while vectoring hunter-killer groups directly onto the waiting submarines. The Germans would watch as convoy after convoy inexplicably altered course just before reaching the waiting U-boats, while Allied warships appeared with impossible accuracy at U-boat assembly points. Dönitz would tear his hair out trying to understand how convoys always seemed to zigzag at exactly the right moment. He never suspected that the British were reading his every order while simultaneously knowing their own codes were compromised, using that double knowledge to orchestrate the systematic destruction of his fleet. Captain Heinz Bonatz would later write in his unpublished memoirs, documents discovered by historians decades after his death, about his growing suspicions in late 1943. "The enemy seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of our dispositions," he wrote. "Convoys would alter course at the last possible moment, always just beyond our patrol lines. Supply submarines were caught at remote refueling points that should have been impossible to locate by chance. It was as if they could see our operations unfolding in real time." Yet when he raised these concerns with Admiral Dönitz and with colleagues at B. Dienst, he was told repeatedly that Enigma's security had been mathematically proven. "I was made to feel paranoid for suggesting what the evidence clearly indicated," he wrote. "The institutional certainty that Enigma could not be broken was so powerful that it overrode obvious operational evidence to the contrary. We had become prisoners of our own technical confidence." The preservation of the ultra-secret, the British codename for intelligence derived from broken Enigma traffic, represented one of the most successful deception operations in military history, a campaign of misdirection that would continue for 30 years after the war ended. Winston Churchill famously called Bletchley Park the goose that laid the golden eggs but never cackled, understanding with perfect clarity that the strategic advantage of reading German communications far outweighed any tactical benefit from acting on specific intelligence. Churchill had seen intelligence assessments in the First World War. He understood how wars could be won or lost based on information advantages. But he also understood that intelligence assets were fragile, that the enemy was always looking for evidence of compromise. that operational security had to be absolute. The security architecture surrounding Ultra was unprecedented in its scope, its discipline, and its effectiveness at maintaining secrecy against a determined, intelligent, and suspicious enemy. Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham, appointed by Secret Intelligence Service Chief Stuart Menzies, established the Special Liaison Unit System, SLU, in 1940. These units, eventually numbering 40 worldwide from North Africa to the Pacific, maintained absolute control over ultra-intelligence distribution. Each SLU officer was personally vetted by Winterbotham, often subjected to weeks of background investigation and required to sign the Official Secrets Act with the explicit understanding that violation meant execution for treason, even after the war ended. This wasn't bureaucratic exaggeration. The penalty for revealing Ultra was death, and everyone involved knew it. SLU officers carried Ultra intelligence in locked briefcases, delivered it personally to authorized commanders, waited while they read the materials, and then retrieved every document. Nothing could be copied. Nothing could be filed. No reference to Ultra sources could appear in operational orders. The intelligence had to be memorized or acted upon immediately, then the physical evidence destroyed. The physical security measures at Bletchley Park itself bordered on paranoia, but this paranoia was entirely justified given what was at stake. The estate's 580 acres were surrounded by military police posts, with over 9,000 personnel working in complete compartmentalization by the war's end. Codebreakers in Hut 8, working on naval Enigma, had no knowledge of work in Hut 6 on Wehrmacht traffic. Even within huts, personnel knew only their specific task. A translator might spend years rendering German messages into English without knowing their source or the significance of the content. Bomb machine operators setting up rotor configurations and testing cribs had no idea how those cribs were derived or what messages were being decoded. This compartmentalization was strictly enforced. Personnel caught discussing their work with colleagues in other sections faced immediate dismissal and possible prosecution. The entire operation functioned like a vast machine where each component performed its task without understanding the larger mechanism. To mask the source of ultra-intelligence and protect the secret against German investigation, the British created increasingly elaborate deceptions that would have impressed professional magicians. The original cover story involved a fictional super spy network codenamed Boniface, supposedly run by an anti-Nazi German officer in Berlin with access to highest-level communications. Early ultra-intelligence was attributed to this non-existent source, and German counterintelligence wasted considerable effort trying to identify the traitor within their high command. When acting on ultra-intelligence, false reconnaissance flights were routinely conducted to provide plausible discovery stories. After using ultra-intelligence to pinpoint and destroy an Italian convoy bound for North Africa, the British transmitted a radio message in a cipher they knew the Germans had broken, thanking a non-existent agent in Naples for the vital information. The Germans, intercepting this message, concluded that British success came from human intelligence rather than signals intelligence, precisely the wrong conclusion and exactly what the British intended. The most sophisticated deception involved the careful calibration of action versus inaction, of knowing when to use intelligence and when to let opportunities pass to protect the source. The Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, under Commander Roger Wynne, developed precise protocols for using ultra-intelligence that balanced immediate tactical advantage against long-term strategic security. Attacks on U-boats were timed to occur only after plausible detection opportunities. If Ultra revealed a U-boat's position, Allied forces would wait until they could credibly claim a chance aircraft sighting or surface vessel contact before attacking. When Ultra revealed U-boat refueling rendezvous, attacks were delayed until the submarines had been together long enough that discovery might seem coincidental. Sometimes preserving Ultra meant accepting terrible losses, sacrificing tactical advantages to protect the strategic asset. The mathematics of this decision-making were cold-blooded but necessary. Lose ships today to preserve the intelligence advantage that would win the war tomorrow. On November 14, 1940, German bombers devastated Coventry in a raid that killed 568 civilians and destroyed much of the medieval city center. Post-war mythology claimed that Churchill knew from Enigma decrypts that Coventry was the target but refused to evacuate the city to protect Ultra, that he made a conscious decision to sacrifice civilians to preserve the secret. Declassified documents reveal a more complex truth. Enigma had revealed Operation Moonlight Sonata was planned, but initially indicated 5 possible targets across England. When radio beam navigation analysis finally confirmed Coventry as the target just hours before the raid, immediate defensive measures were taken, including fighter patrols, anti-aircraft reinforcements, and preparation of emergency services. But large-scale civilian evacuation was impossible given the limited warning time, and unusual defensive preparations might have alerted the Germans that their intentions were known. The real horror is that even with foreknowledge, there was little that could be done against a major bomber raid with 1940s technology. The story of Churchill's deliberate sacrifice was itself a post-war deception, spread to hide the actual capabilities and limitations of Ultra intelligence, to make the Germans think Ultra had provided more specific advance warning than it actually did. The story now takes us to specific operations where Ultra intelligence turned the tide of battle, where German commanders unknowingly fought against enemies reading their every thought, and where the preservation of the secret required theatrical deception of extraordinary sophistication. March 25, 1941. In Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, in a cramped room that smelled of stale cigarettes and strong tea, a young woman named Mavis Lever sat hunched over intercepted Italian naval messages. She had been recruited from Cambridge University, where she had studied German literature, never imagining that her linguistic skills would place her at the center of history's greatest intelligence operation. She had been working 16-hour days, attempting to break the Italian naval Enigma variant, a machine similar to but distinct from the German version, with subtle differences in rotor wiring and operational procedures. And suddenly, after days of frustration, the patterns clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. The message she decoded was electric in its implications, the kind of intelligence that could change the course of a campaign. Today, 25th of March, is D3, the message read when fully decrypted. Start of the operation. Mavis immediately understood the significance. The Italian fleet was planning a major operation in exactly 3 days. This was actionable intelligence of the highest order. Working through the night with her colleague Margaret Rock, sustained by endless cups of tea and the adrenaline of breakthrough, she decoded additional messages revealing the complete Italian battle plan in devastating detail. Admiral Angelo Iacchino would sortie with the battleship Vittorio Veneto, 6 heavy cruisers, and 17 destroyers to attack British convoys between Egypt and Greece. The intelligence reached Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the British Mediterranean Fleet in Alexandria, within hours through the SLU network. Cunningham was a theatrical commander who understood the importance of deception and the necessity of protecting intelligence sources. He knew that if the Italians suspected the British had advanced knowledge of their operation, they would investigate their communications security. He had to appear completely unaware while secretly preparing for battle. Cunningham spent March 27th ostentatiously playing golf at the Alexandria Sporting Club, making certain that Italian spies known to operate in Alexandria would report that the British fleet showed no signs of preparation. He joked with fellow officers, discussed weekend plans, behaved exactly as he would if no operations were planned. That night, after returning to his flagship HMS Warspite with studied casualness, carrying his golf clubs and chatting about his game, he ordered the fleet to sea. The Italian fleet, confident their plans were secret, had no idea they were sailing into a carefully prepared ambush orchestrated by an enemy who had read their orders days in advance. British torpedo bombers from the carrier HMS Formidable struck first, damaging Vittorio Veneto and crippling the heavy cruiser Pola. When Italian cruisers Zara and Fiume returned after dark to assist Pola, following standard Italian doctrine for mutual support, they sailed directly into the guns of Cunningham's battleships at point-blank range under perfect radar fire control conditions. In minutes, in a one-sided slaughter that Italian survivors would remember with horror for the rest of their lives, both cruisers and 2 destroyers were destroyed by overwhelming naval gunfire. Over 2,400 Italian sailors died, including Admiral Carlo Cataneo and the captains of all three lost cruisers. Admiral Iacchino, surviving aboard the damaged Vittorio Veneto, attributed the disaster to British radar superiority and lucky reconnaissance. In his after-action report, a document that German naval liaison officers read and filed without suspicion, he wrote, "The enemy's discovery of our force must be attributed to their superior aerial reconnaissance and radar technology, which allowed them to track our movements even at night." The possibility that the British had been reading Italian naval orders for days never entered Italian or German analysis. The psychological impact rippled through Axis naval planning in ways that would influence the entire Mediterranean campaign. Hitler, already skeptical of surface naval warfare after the loss of Graf Spee, saw the Battle of Matapan as confirmation that the Mediterranean was effectively a British lake, that major fleet operations were too risky. The Italian fleet, which had posed a significant threat to British convoys supplying North Africa, never again attempted major offensive operations. Yet through it all, neither Italian nor German intelligence suspected that cryptanalysis, not reconnaissance or radar, had orchestrated their destruction. May 18, 1941, 11:30 p.m. At Bletchley Park, the teleprinter in Hut 8 clattered to life with an intercepted German naval message, the distinctive rhythmic sound that codebreakers had learned to recognize even in their sleep. Harry Hinsley, a 21-year-old Cambridge undergraduate who had been recruited into intelligence work based on his performance in mathematics, recognized its significance immediately. The message from Admiral Günther Lütjens aboard the battleship Bismarck reported his departure from Gotenhafen for Operation Rheinübung, an Atlantic commerce raiding mission designed to devastate British convoy routes. The British Admiralty had been anticipating this moment for months with increasing anxiety. Bismarck represented the greatest threat to Atlantic convoys since the war began, perhaps the greatest threat Britain had ever faced at sea. With its 8 15-inch guns, advanced fire control systems capable of accurate shooting at ranges exceeding 20 miles, and heavy armor protection, it could destroy any British cruiser in a one-sided fight and outrun any battleship capable of matching its firepower. If Bismarck reached the Atlantic shipping lanes, the massacre of merchant ships would be unprecedented, potentially severing the lifeline that kept Britain in the war. But forewarned by ultra-intelligence, the Royal Navy had precious time to prepare a coordinated response. Admiral John Tovey positioned the home fleet to intercept, calculating Bismarck's most likely routes into the Atlantic. Force H under Admiral James Somerville moved north from Gibraltar, creating a pincer movement. The cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk were stationed in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, with specific orders to shadow using their new Type 284 radar, maintaining contact without engaging. Every movement had been choreographed based on intercepted German messages that revealed not just Bismarck's departure, but its intended operational area and tactical objectives. When Bismarck was finally spotted in the Denmark Strait on May 23rd, the British painted the discovery as lucky reconnaissance by HMS Suffolk's lookouts. In reality, ultra-intelligence had revealed not just Bismarck's route, but its precise timetable, allowing British cruisers to be positioned exactly where Bismarck would pass. The subsequent battle that destroyed HMS Hood was a tactical disaster the British hadn't anticipated, a devastating blow to national morale. Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, exploded and sank in less than 3 minutes after a catastrophic magazine detonation, taking all but 3 of her 1,400 crew to the bottom. But strategic victory was already assured through intelligence advantage. Bismarck was now damaged, leaking oil from a ruptured fuel tank and tracked by radar-equipped shadowers, whose positions were continuously updated by ultra-intercepts, revealing German damage assessments and intentions. On May 25th, Admiral Lütjens made a fatal error born of ignorance about British capabilities. Unaware that British radar contact had been temporarily lost due to a misunderstood maneuver, he transmitted a long radio message to Naval Group West, describing his damage and intentions in detail. The transmission lasted over 30 minutes, more than enough time for British direction-finding stations scattered across Britain and Iceland to plot his position with triangulation. But more importantly, far more decisively, the message was decoded at Bletchley Park within hours, revealing that Bismarck was heading for Brest and had insufficient fuel for evasive maneuvering. The final act unfolded with grim inevitability, orchestrated by intelligence. Catalina flying boats, positioned based on ultra-intelligence, accidentally spotted Bismarck precisely where the decrypts had placed it. Swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Ark Royal, operating at the extreme limit of their range in terrible weather that should have made accurate attack impossible, somehow managed to score the critical hit that jammed Bismarck's rudder, leaving the battleship circling helplessly. On the morning of May 27th, the converging British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney pounded Bismarck into scrap metal in a one-sided battle that lasted less than 2 hours. Of 2,221 German sailors aboard, only 114 survived the freezing waters. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, analyzed the disaster with growing frustration that would consume him for months. How had the British maintained contact across thousands of miles of ocean? How had they concentrated overwhelming force at precisely the right moment, despite the vastness of the Atlantic? His investigation, thorough and professional, concluded that British naval aviation and radar technology had advanced beyond German expectations, that German intelligence had underestimated British capabilities. The possibility that the British had been reading his every order, tracking Bismarck's every movement through decoded messages, never entered serious consideration. In his memoirs written years before Ultra was revealed, memoirs that would require revision after 1974, Raeder attributed the loss to unfortunate mechanical failure and the enemy's lucky torpedo hit, never suspecting that luck had nothing to do with it. May 1943 began with Admiral Dönitz commanding the largest U-boat fleet in history, a force he believed could finally achieve victory in the Atlantic. 116 submarines patrolled the North Atlantic, organized into wolfpacks with predatory names that reflected their intended ferocity: Fink, Finch, Amsel, Blackbird, Miser, Tit, and Star. German B-Dienst cryptanalysts were reading British convoy codes with impressive success, and Dönitz felt victory was within reach after years of grinding attrition. "The enemy is showing signs of exhaustion," he wrote in his war diary on May 1st, his confidence evident in every word. "One more concentrated effort, and the Atlantic supply line will be cut. Britain will be forced to negotiate." What Dönitz couldn't know, what no amount of tactical success could reveal to him, was that Bletchley Park had achieved a cryptanalytic breakthrough that would seal his fleet's fate in ways he wouldn't understand for 31 years. After a 10-month blackout caused by the introduction of the four-rotor Enigma in February 1942, a period of desperate frustration at Bletchley Park when naval Enigma went dark, British cryptanalysts had finally mastered the M4 cipher through a combination of captured materials and technological innovation. Using codebooks from U-559, recovered by sailors who drowned retrieving them from the sinking submarine in October 1942, and employing the world's first programmable electronic computer, Colossus, along with improved bombs, they were again reading German naval traffic within hours of transmission. The intelligence advantage was total and devastating. The first convoy battle of May set the pattern for the slaughter to come, establishing the tactical dynamics that would define Black May. Convoy ONS-5, consisting of 42 merchantmen bound from Liverpool to Halifax, was spotted by U-650 on April 28th. Dönitz, reading the contact report and believing he had achieved surprise, concentrated 3 wolf packs, 41 U-boats in total, for what he intended as a decisive battle that would demonstrate the continuing effectiveness of his tactics. Reading his every order as they were transmitted, the Admiralty reinforced the convoy's escort with additional destroyers and corvettes, positioned support groups to intercept U-boats before they could reach attack positions, and routed additional forces based on perfect knowledge of German deployment. The battle raged for 6 days across 600 miles of storm-tossed ocean. German submarines sank 13 merchant ships in attacks, that demonstrated the continued skill and courage of U-boat crews, but at a terrible cost that shocked German naval command. 7 U-boats were destroyed by convoy escorts that seemed to anticipate every German tactic. U-192, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Werner Happe, was depth-charged by HMS Loosestrife after being detected by high-frequency direction-finding equipment positioned based on ultra-intelligence. U-638 went down with all hands after being rammed by HMS Sunflower in an engagement that left the corvette's bow crumpled, but the submarine destroyed. U-125, U-531, U-438, U-630, and U-528 followed in quick succession, each destroyed by escorts that appeared with impossible accuracy at intercept points. For the first time in the war, the exchange rate decisively favored the Allies. More U-boats were being destroyed than merchant ships sunk. The mathematics of attrition that had sustained Dönitz's strategy for 4 years had suddenly catastrophically reversed. But this was just the beginning of the slaughter. As May progressed, each convoy battle became a massacre of German submarines orchestrated by intelligence that revealed every German move before it was executed. Reading German deployment orders in real time, the Allies routed convoys through carefully calculated gaps in the patrol lines, while vectoring hunter-killer groups directly onto wolfpack assembly points. Aircraft equipped with new Lee lights, powerful searchlights that could illuminate surfaced submarines at night, caught U-boats charging batteries on the surface, the vulnerable period when submarines had to run diesel engines to recharge the batteries that powered underwater movement. Ships equipped with Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, weapons that threw contact-fused bombs in a pattern ahead of the attacking ship, achieved kill rates that stunned their own commanders. The old depth charge had required passing over the submarine's position, allowing experienced commanders to take evasive action during the attack run. Hedgehog struck before the submarine could maneuver, and ultra-intelligence often provided precise enough information to guide Hedgehog attacks with devastating accuracy. Convoy HX-237, crossing in mid-May, destroyed 3 U-boats without losing a single merchant vessel, a complete reversal of the usual pattern. Convoy SC-130 sank 5 submarines while suffering no losses, an unprecedented achievement that should have triggered alarm in German naval intelligence. The new escort carrier USS Bogue, operating with perfect intelligence from Ultra that directed it to U-boat positions like a bloodhound following a scent trail, sank 6 U-boats in as many weeks. German submarines were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and experienced commanders who had survived years of warfare, men whose knowledge and skill were irreplaceable, were dying in waters they had once dominated with near impunity. The statistics were catastrophic in ways that should have been impossible. In May 1943, Germany lost 41 U-boats, nearly 25% of its operational fleet, in a single month. 7 were destroyed by aircraft in the Bay of Biscay, trying to leave or return to base, caught by patrols positioned based on ultra-intelligence about departure and arrival schedules. 6 were caught refueling from submarine tankers at coordinates revealed by decoded Enigma messages. 12 were killed by convoy escorts that seemed to anticipate their every move, appearing at intercept points with impossible accuracy. The youngest victim was U-209 on its first patrol, destroyed with all 50 hands on May 7th by depth charges from HMS Duncan. The crew had trained for months, prepared for every contingency their instructors could imagine, but not for the reality that their position had been known to the enemy before they left port. The most experienced was U-192, whose commander had survived 12 previous patrols through skill, courage, and luck, sent to the bottom on May 6th, when that luck finally ran out against escorts guided by intelligence. On May 24th, Dönitz issued the order that marked the effective end of the Battle of the Atlantic as he had conceived it. All U-boats were to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes immediately and regroup in waters southwest of the Azores, abandoning the campaign that had been the Kriegsmarine's primary strategic effort for 4 years. In his war diary, he wrote with bitter resignation, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He attributed the defeat to Allied radar and aircraft, to material superiority and technological advancement, never suspecting that his own communications had orchestrated the destruction of his fleet. That every tactical decision he had made was known to the enemy, before his commanders received their orders. One of the most remarkable aspects of the ultra-secret, an aspect that demonstrates the sophistication of Allied intelligence operations, was how close the Germans came to discovering the truth, only to be deliberately misdirected by deception operations of extraordinary complexity. The most sophisticated of these deceptions involved the Lucy Ring, a Soviet spy network operating from Switzerland that seemed to have extraordinary access to German military secrets, access that German counterintelligence found both impressive and deeply troubling. Rudolf Rösler, codenamed Lucy, was a German refugee publisher living in Lucerne, who ran what appeared to be an independent intelligence network with sources deep within the Wehrmacht. From 1942 onwards, Lucy provided Soviet intelligence with remarkably accurate information about German military operations, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the life and death struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union was consuming millions of lives and determining the war's outcome. His reports included detailed Wehrmacht order of battle information, offensive plans sometimes days or weeks before execution, and even verbatim texts of Hitler's operational directives, information so precise and timely that both German and Soviet intelligence suspected it came from highest-level sources within the Wehrmacht High Command, or possibly even within Hitler's inner circle. German counterintelligence launched multiple investigations into the Lucy Ring, convinced they had a major traitor in their ranks, perhaps multiple traitors forming a conspiracy. The Abwehr and Gestapo investigated dozens of senior officers, including members of the Wehrmacht operations staff with access to Enigma traffic and strategic planning documents. The investigations were thorough, professional, and ultimately futile. What they never discovered was that Lucy's information came not from traitors, but from Bletchley Park, laundered through Swiss intelligence to disguise its true source, through a deception operation of remarkable sophistication. The British faced a delicate problem that required careful handling. Soviet forces desperately needed ultra-intelligence to counter German offensives, particularly during the critical period of 1942 and 43, when the Eastern Front hung in the balance. But Stalin was deeply suspicious of British motives, paranoid about capitalist manipulation, and unlikely to trust intelligence from Western allies. He suspected of wanting Germany and Russia to bleed each other white. Moreover, directly sharing Ultra with the Soviets risked exposure through their less secure communication methods and potential German agents within Soviet intelligence, agents the British knew existed but couldn't identify. The solution was elegant and required perfect operational security. Ultra intelligence was selectively passed to Swiss intelligence, who fed it to Rösler with the cover story that it came from anti-Nazi officers in the Wehrmacht, members of the resistance who wanted to see Hitler defeated. Rösler then transmitted it to Soviet intelligence through his handler Alexander Rado, a Hungarian communist who operated under Swiss cover. The Soviets, believing they had their own source independent of the Western Allies, acted on the intelligence with confidence, while the Germans, discovering the accuracy of Lucy's reports through their own agents and interrogations of captured Soviet officers, launched investigations that pointed everywhere except Bletchley Park. Throughout 1943 and 44, evidence of Allied foreknowledge accumulated to levels that should have been undeniable to any objective observer. Yet German investigators, trapped by their fundamental assumption of Enigma's security, consistently found alternative explanations that seemed more plausible than accepting communications compromise. The systematic destruction of U-boat supply submarines provided perhaps the most obvious evidence, statistical anomalies so extreme they defied conventional explanation. These milk cow submarines, large Type 14th U-boats, designed specifically for refueling and resupply operations, operated at secret refueling points in remote areas of the Atlantic, positions known only to U-boat command and the submarines they were scheduled to supply. The coordinates were transmitted via Enigma only to boats that needed refueling, using officer-only cipher settings that German cryptographers considered even more secure than standard naval Enigma. Between June and August 1943, 10 of 14 supply submarines were destroyed, most caught at their exact refueling coordinates in the middle of empty ocean. U-459, destroyed on July 24 while refueling U-117, went down at a position 500 miles from the nearest shipping lane, in waters so remote that chance discovery was statistically impossible. U-489 was caught on August 4th at coordinates that had been transmitted just 48 hours earlier to submarines desperately low on fuel. Captain José Hermann Moore, investigating these losses for naval intelligence in an inquiry that should have uncovered the truth, wrote in his report, "The probability of chance discovery of our supply operations is mathematically negligible. Either the enemy has developed detection capabilities beyond our current understanding, or we have a serious breach of security." Yet his investigation focused entirely on possible human intelligence sources, crew members who might have been turned by British intelligence, neutral sailors who might have observed departure patterns at French bases, even the possibility of Allied agents with radio transmitters hidden near submarine pens. The idea that the British were simply reading German position reports transmitted via Enigma was mentioned in his report, but dismissed in a single sentence. Cryptographic compromise has been ruled out by technical experts. Even more damning evidence came from the precision of Allied operations against new German weapons and tactics. Responses so immediate, they seemed to indicate foreknowledge. When Germany introduced the acoustic torpedo, the Zaunkönig, or Wren, in September 1943, a weapon designed to home in on convoy escort propellers and restore U-boat effectiveness, the Allies immediately deployed effective countermeasures before the weapon could achieve significant success. Foxer noise-making devices, towed behind escorts, decoyed the torpedoes away from their intended targets. The German explanation, arrived at after investigation, was that Allied intelligence must have captured sample torpedoes from destroyed U-boats and reverse-engineered the acoustic homing system. When U-boats began using new Courier burst radio transmissions in 1944, compressing messages into less than half a second to defeat direction finding, Allied forces still managed to locate and attack submarines with disturbing accuracy. The German conclusion was that the Allies must have developed direction-finding equipment capable of detecting even these brief transmissions, a technological achievement that German scientists considered unlikely but more believable than the alternative. The Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, Captain Yokoi Tadao, provided perhaps the most telling observation from an outsider's perspective, someone not caught up in German institutional assumptions. After analyzing the pattern of Allied operations in 1944, studying intelligence summaries and operational reports with fresh eyes, he reported to Tokyo in a message that American cryptanalysts intercepted and decoded. The precision of enemy intelligence suggests they are reading German communications. This seems impossible given German security measures, but no other explanation fits the evidence I have observed. His report, intercepted and decoded by American cryptanalysts who had broken Japanese diplomatic codes through their own parallel cryptanalytic triumph, caused brief concern at Bletchley Park. Would the Japanese warning finally trigger the comprehensive German investigation that would expose Ultra? Fortunately for the Allies, German naval intelligence dismissed Japanese concerns as face-saving excuses for their own intelligence failures in the Pacific, where American code-breaking had devastated Japanese naval operations with similar totality. Admiral Karl Dönitz represented perhaps the most tragic figure in this story of institutional blindness, a capable and intelligent officer whose very competence became a barrier to recognizing uncomfortable truths. Widely regarded as a brilliant tactician and inspirational leader who had transformed submarine warfare, his innovations became the instruments of his fleet's destruction in ways he wouldn't understand until 1974. His centralized command system, which he considered his greatest contribution to naval warfare, had become the mechanism through which the British orchestrated the systematic annihilation of his U-boats. Dönitz had revolutionized submarine warfare through his Rudel tactic, wolfpack tactics, combined with centralized tactical control from headquarters. Using powerful radio transmitters, he personally directed wolfpack operations from situation rooms in Lorient, Paris, and finally Berlin, maintaining direct command of boats scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Every U-boat commander reported position, fuel state, torpedo inventory, and contact reports through regular radio transmissions. Dönitz would then orchestrate attacks like a conductor directing a symphony, vectoring boats onto convoys with precise timing and positioning calculated to overwhelm escorts through coordinated assault. This system required constant radio communication, exactly what allowed Bletchley Park to track every U-boat in the Atlantic with near-perfect fidelity. Dönitz transmitted over 70 radio messages daily to his fleet on average, each one decoded by British cryptanalysts working in shifts around the clock. His detailed orders revealed not just current positions, but future intentions, patrol patterns, tactical innovations, even assessments of crew morale and boat mechanical status. Yet Dönitz's faith in his system never wavered throughout the war. When subordinates questioned the wisdom of such extensive radio traffic, raising concerns about direction finding or possible compromise, he responded with detailed technical explanations that seemed to close the discussion. The Enigma was unbreakable by computational standards that any rational analysis would confirm. German radio discipline was superior to any navy in history, enforced through rigorous training and severe penalties for violations. Short signal codebooks compressed messages to defeat direction finding by reducing transmission time. Frequency changes and call sign modifications prevented traffic analysis by making it difficult for the enemy to identify which radio signals came from which boats. In his mind, shaped by years of professional military education and confidence in German technical superiority, these measures guaranteed security. His war diary reveals a commander increasingly frustrated by inexplicable Allied prescience, by tactical situations that made no logical sense, but never questioning his fundamental assumptions about communications security. Entry after entry describes convoys taking impossible evasive actions, altering course at precisely the moment that would avoid waiting wolfpacks, escorts appearing at unlikely positions where no escorts should logically be stationed, aircraft catching U-boats at improbable moments when weather should have prevented air operations. Yet his conclusions remained tragically consistent throughout the war. The Allies had more aircraft than German intelligence estimated, better radar than German scientists believed possible, superior resources that allowed saturation coverage of vast ocean areas. Never once did he write the obvious conclusion that would have been unavoidable for someone without his psychological investment in the system. They are reading our mail. The psychological investment in his command system made recognition of compromise psychologically impossible. To admit Enigma was compromised would mean acknowledging that his entire approach to submarine warfare, the very innovation that had made him Hitler's chosen successor as head of state, had been fundamentally flawed from the start. Every order he had given, every tactical innovation he had developed through careful analysis of battle reports, every submarine he had sent to its death with confidence in his strategy, had been transparent to the enemy. The weight of such knowledge would have been crushing, perhaps psychologically unbearable for a man who took his responsibilities with absolute seriousness. Even after the war, before Ultra's revelation in 1974, Dönitz maintained absolute confidence in his wartime decisions and strategic judgment. His memoirs, published in 1958 under the title 10 Jahre und 20 Tage, attributed U-boat losses to Allied material superiority and technological advancement in radar and aircraft. He calculated that Germany would have needed 300 submarines operational simultaneously to cut Britain's supply lines decisively, never realizing that even 3,000 boats would have failed if the Allies continued reading his every command, that the number of submarines was irrelevant when the enemy knew where every boat was positioned. May 9, 1946. International Military Tribunal, Nuremberg. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood in the dock alongside other surviving Nazi leaders, defending his conduct of submarine warfare before Allied prosecutors who knew truths they couldn't reveal. His testimony that day would unknowingly reveal the depth of German ignorance about Ultra, while simultaneously demonstrating how close he had come to the truth without quite grasping it. The enemy's superiority in locating our submarines was overwhelming, Dönitz testified, in response to questions about U-boat losses. By 1943, our losses had reached insupportable levels. I was forced to withdraw from the convoy routes, to abandon the campaign that might have won the war. When pressed by prosecutors about specific incidents, about the uncanny accuracy of Allied operations, Dönitz's explanations consistently avoided the real cause while touching on elements of truth. Regarding the destruction of supply submarines at remote coordinates, he stated, "We suspected that the enemy had developed new long-range detection equipment, possibly using infrared signatures from diesel engines or other emanations we could not detect with our equipment. We also investigated the possibility of traitors within our organization, but found no concrete evidence of betrayal." When asked about convoys that seemed to avoid wolfpacks with supernatural precision, zigzagging away just before reaching U-boat patrol lines, Dönitz replied with conviction, "The enemy's air reconnaissance had reached saturation levels by 1943 and 44. They could maintain almost continuous surveillance of vast ocean areas. Combined with their radar capabilities, which exceeded our initial estimates, they could track our movements and route convoys accordingly." The prosecution, fully aware of ultra but bound by secrecy that would last another 28 years, pressed Dönitz on specific intelligence failures without revealing their source. Sir David Maxwell Fyfe questioned him about the interception of U-459 at precise refueling coordinates, about the destruction of wolfpacks at assembly points, about the failure of every major tactical innovation within weeks of implementation. To each question, Dönitz had a technical explanation: high-frequency direction-finding networks that could triangulate submarine positions from brief radio transmissions, centimetric radar that German detection equipment couldn't receive, talk between ships' radio systems that allowed instant coordination of escort groups, air-to-surface vessel radar that could detect periscopes, magnetic anomaly detection equipment carried by aircraft, sonobuoys that could detect submerged submarines. Each explanation was partially correct. These technologies did exist and were employed by Allied forces, but none addressed the fundamental intelligence advantage that made their application so devastating that allowed them to be positioned in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The most telling exchange came when Maxwell Fyfe questioned Dönitz directly about communication security. "Admiral, did you at any time suspect your communications were compromised?" "I investigated this possibility multiple times," Dönitz replied. "Our cryptographic experts assured me that Enigma was mathematically secure. Breaking it would require computational resources beyond any nation's capability, resources that would be better spent on other intelligence activities. Yet your losses continued to mount." "Yes, but this was due to enemy technological superiority, not intelligence failure. They had radar that could detect a periscope at 20 miles, aircraft that could appear without warning through clouds, weapons systems we could not effectively counter. The technological balance shifted against us. You never suspected they might be reading your radio traffic. Our communications were protected by the most sophisticated encryption system in existence," Dönitz stated, with conviction that would haunt him decades later. "The possibility you suggest was examined by our finest mathematical minds and conclusively rejected as computationally impossible." What makes this testimony particularly poignant in historical hindsight was Dönitz's obvious intelligence and analytical capability evident in his responses. His IQ had been tested at 138 by German military psychologists, well into the gifted range. He had correctly identified many Allied capabilities and innovations through careful analysis of patrol reports and battle results. He had asked the right questions, demanded thorough investigations, pushed his intelligence staff for answers. Yet the mental barrier created by faith in Enigma security proved absolutely impermeable, a blind spot that no amount of intelligence could overcome because it rested on psychological rather than intellectual foundations. Perhaps the most damning evidence of German institutional blindness came on August 10, 1943, when Swiss intelligence, neutral and generally reliable, provided an explicit warning that should have triggered immediate and comprehensive action. The Swiss intelligence service, through sources that remain partially classified to this day, had learned of Allied cryptanalytic success against German naval codes through their own observation of operational patterns. Their report, delivered through diplomatic channels to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr, was stark and unambiguous in its implications. Over the last few months, Germany's naval ciphers, which are used to give operational orders to the U-boats, have been successfully broken by Allied cryptanalytic services. All orders are being read currently with minimal delay. This was not vague intelligence or unconfirmed rumor. This was an explicit warning from a neutral intelligence service with no obvious motive to deceive. The German response revealed the depth of their psychological investment in Enigma's security. Dönitz, informed of the Swiss report, wrote in his war diary on August 13th, "Report from Switzerland claims enemy is reading our cipher. This is unbelievable and contradicts all technical assessments." He ordered yet another security review, but with predetermined conclusions that made genuine investigation impossible. The investigation, led by Korvettenkapitän Meckel, who had conducted previous reviews, dismissed the Swiss intelligence as Allied disinformation designed to undermine German confidence in their communications. The investigating committee's reasoning was revealing of their mindset. If the Allies could read German naval communications with the completeness the Swiss report suggested, why hadn't they achieved even more devastating victories? Why did some convoys still blunder into wolfpacks? Why did U-boats sometimes successfully evade hunter-killer groups? These questions, which seemed to disprove the Swiss warning, had simple answers that German investigators couldn't imagine. The Allies deliberately allowed some losses to preserve their secret, sacrificing ships and lives today to protect the intelligence advantage that would win the war tomorrow. But German investigators couldn't conceive of such strategic restraint, such willingness to accept casualties for long-term advantage. German counterintelligence also investigated the source of Swiss information rather than its substance. They concluded it must have come from Allied agents attempting to create paranoia within the German Naval Command, a psychological operation designed to make German commanders question their communications and perhaps change systems in ways that would actually make them less secure. The possibility that Swiss intelligence had simply observed the obvious, that Allied operations showed clear and overwhelming evidence of foreknowledge, was never seriously considered. The Germans literally could not see what neutral observers saw clearly. The German failure to conceive of Bletchley Park's operation stemmed partly from their inability to imagine the technological and organizational innovations that made industrial-scale code-breaking possible, innovations that represented a genuine revolution in intelligence gathering. German cryptanalysts worked with paper, pencils, and mechanical calculating machines, occasionally assisted by early punched card sorting equipment borrowed from census operations. The idea of electronic computation, of machines that could test thousands of Enigma settings per hour automatically, existed only in the realm of theoretical mathematics and science fiction. The conceptual gap between what was theoretically possible and what seemed practically achievable was simply too large for them to bridge. By 1944, Bletchley Park had become the world's first industrial-scale computing center, a prototype of the information age that would transform the post-war world. The Colossus machines, designed by Tommy Flowers and kept absolutely secret even within Bletchley Park, where most personnel had no idea they existed, could process 5,000 characters per second, a speed that German mathematicians wouldn't have believed possible with any technology they could imagine. The bomb machines, developed from Polish designs by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, could test over 17,000 Enigma positions in 20 minutes, work that would take human cryptanalysts months of continuous effort. The organizational structure was equally beyond German imagination or experience. Bletchley Park employed over 9,000 people by 1945, including 80% women who operated the machines, transcribed intercepts, managed the vast filing systems that tracked millions of decoded messages, and performed the endless clerical work that made the operation function. 3 shifts operated 24 hours daily, 7 days a week, processing over 3,000 intercepted messages per day at peak capacity. Messages were prioritized by operational importance, with U-boat communications receiving highest priority for naval intelligence, then surface fleet movements, then Luftwaffe operations, then Wehrmacht ground forces. The systematic approach to cryptanalysis would have amazed German experts accustomed to viewing code breaking as an art form requiring individual genius. Every Enigma message ever decoded was filed and cross-referenced in massive card catalogs. Patterns in operator behavior were catalogued meticulously. Lazy operators who used girlfriends' names as message keys, predictable weather reports that provided cribs, standard military phrases that appeared in routine communications. The British had industrialized a process Germans still considered an art, requiring exceptional individual talent. When German cryptanalysts were later shown the scope of Bletchley Park's operations, their reactions mixed professional admiration with personal devastation. Dr. Erich Huttenheim, when interrogated and told of Bletchley Park's scale and organization, reportedly said, "No wonder you broke it. You treated cryptanalysis like building bombers, like mass production in a factory. We treated it like writing poetry, depending on individual genius and inspiration. We never imagined codebreaking could be industrialized." A critical moment of near discovery came on November 30th, 1943, when a British Lancaster bomber was shot down near Berlin during a nighttime raid. Among the wreckage, which German investigators examined meticulously for intelligence value, they found something that should have triggered immediate alarm and comprehensive investigation. A partially burned document, recovered from the navigator's position, contained what appeared to be German naval grid references and U-boat positions dated just 48 hours earlier. This was current operational intelligence, not historical data or planning documents. Hauptmann Wilhelm Dose of Luftwaffe Intelligence was assigned to investigate what appeared to be a significant security breach. The document was fragmentary, partially destroyed by fire and impact, but clearly showed positions of 3 U-boats, U-391, U-238 and U-648, at coordinates that matched their actual locations on November 28th, with disturbing precision. This intelligence was far too precise and recent to have come from aerial reconnaissance, which would have required perfect weather and impossible luck. It couldn't have come from agent reports, which would lack such precision. Dose's investigation was thorough and professional, but ultimately misdirected by the assumption that Enigma remained secure. He concluded the British must have an extensive network of agents in French ports reporting U-boat departures and returns. Combined with direction-finding fixes on German radio transmissions, this could theoretically allow rough position estimates that were then refined through systematic search patterns. The possibility that the British were reading actual German position reports, transmitted via Enigma, was mentioned in his report, but dismissed with a single sentence that revealed the mental block. Cryptographic compromise has been ruled out by technical experts and need not be considered. The close call caused brief panic at Bletchley Park when they learned through ultra-intercepts, ironically, that the Germans had recovered intelligence documents from the downed aircraft. Emergency procedures were implemented immediately. For the next 3 months, ultra-intelligence was distributed with even more elaborate cover stories, and any intelligence that couldn't be plausibly attributed to other sources like reconnaissance or direction finding was withheld from operational use entirely. The system worked. German investigation led nowhere, and within months the incident was forgotten as the war's momentum accelerated toward D-Day and Germany's final defeat. The D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, represented Ultra's greatest triumph and the most complete, comprehensive failure of German intelligence in the entire war. Despite the largest amphibious invasion in human history, involving over 6,000 vessels and 150,000 troops in the first wave, German forces were caught completely by surprise at the operational level. The preservation of tactical surprise when strategic surprise was clearly impossible, when the Germans knew an invasion was coming somewhere, demonstrated the totality of Allied intelligence dominance achieved through Ultra. Through decoded Enigma messages, the Allies knew exactly what German commanders believed about Allied intentions, capabilities, and likely invasion points. Every assessment by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, every defensive preparation ordered by Rommel, every intelligence estimate submitted to Hitler was read at Bletchley Park, often before German recipients decoded their own copies. This allowed the Allies to craft deception operations with surgical precision, tailoring false intelligence to reinforce existing German misconceptions. Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan that convinced Germans the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, succeeded because the Allies could monitor German reactions in real time through ultra-intercepts. When German intelligence reported strong Allied forces massing opposite Calais, actually inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fictional radio traffic generated by a handful of operators, the Allies could read German assessments of this false intelligence and adjust their deception accordingly. When Germans expressed doubts about specific elements of the deception, new evidence was provided through controlled channels to reinforce the false picture. The operation was like playing poker while seeing your opponent's cards, adjusting your bluff based on perfect knowledge of what they believed. Even after D-Day began at dawn on June 6th, ultra-intercepts of German communications revealed they still believed Normandy was a diversion, that the main invasion would come at Calais once the Allies had drawn German reserves away from that obvious target. Hitler's refusal to release panzer reserves from the Calais area for 7 crucial weeks stemmed partly from intelligence assessments the Allies were reading and reinforcing through continued deception operations even after the Normandy beachhead was established. German commanders were not just surprised by the invasion, they were fighting a battle orchestrated by enemies reading their every thought, anticipating their every move, countering their every tactical adjustment before it could take effect. Admiral Theodor Kranke, commanding Naval Group West, would later write about the invasion's intelligence failure. "We knew nothing despite our extensive intelligence apparatus. Our reconnaissance was blind. Our intelligence was deaf. The enemy appeared from nowhere with overwhelming force concentrated at precisely the point where we were weakest." He never suspected that rather than knowing nothing, the fundamental problem was that the Allies knew everything while German knowledge was systematically manipulated through deception. By late 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated on all fronts, accumulating anomalies should have shattered German faith in their communication security if analyzed objectively. U-boats equipped with new snorkel technology, allowing them to remain submerged for entire patrols without surfacing, except in emergencies, were still being caught with disturbing frequency. New acoustic torpedoes were countered before they achieved significant success. Tactical innovations were met with immediate Allied adaptations that suggested foreknowledge. Yet German investigations continued to find alternative explanations that avoided confronting the fundamental question of communication security. When snorkel boats were destroyed, investigators blamed improved Allied sonar and magnetic anomaly detection equipment that could supposedly detect submarines through their magnetic signature. When new wolfpack tactics failed to achieve expected results, they attributed it to Allied air saturation of operational areas, to such overwhelming numbers of aircraft that no tactical innovation could succeed. When supply operations were consistently intercepted, they theorized about infrared detection of diesel exhaust or wake patterns visible from high-altitude reconnaissance. The most telling incident occurred in March 1945, just weeks before Germany's final collapse, when U-866 was destroyed off the American coast just days after departing Norway. The submarine had maintained complete radio silence throughout its Atlantic crossing, using only its snorkel and traveling a route known only to U-boat command and the boat's captain. Its destruction at precise coordinates, caught by American hunter-killer groups positioned exactly where it would pass, should have been impossible without communications intelligence revealing its route. Yet the German investigation, conducted hastily in the war's final chaotic weeks, concluded that American hunter-killer groups had achieved such density off their coast that detection was statistically inevitable, that the destruction represented operational bad luck rather than intelligence compromise. Captain Günther Hessler, Dönitz's son-in-law and chief of U-boat operations, came closest to the truth in April 1945 during a staff meeting as Germany's final collapse approached. In a moment of frustrated candor, he reportedly said, "Either the Americans have technology beyond our comprehension, technology that seems almost magical, or they are reading our thoughts somehow. There is no third explanation that fits the evidence." The response from Admiral Gott, Dönitz's chief of staff, was swift and dismissive, revealing how deeply the certainty about Enigma security had become embedded in institutional culture. "Defeatist thinking will not be tolerated in this command. Our communications remain secure. The mathematical proofs are irrefutable. What we face is material inferiority and technological disadvantage, not intelligence failure. May 1945. As the Third Reich collapsed in flames and chaos, as Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, and Dönitz briefly assumed leadership of a government that controlled virtually no territory, Allied intelligence teams raced across Germany in Operation TICOM, the Target Intelligence Committee, tasked with capturing German cryptographic personnel and materials before they could be destroyed or fall into Soviet hands. What they discovered in interrogations and captured documents was a mixture of sophisticated cryptanalytic capability and stunning blindness to their own vulnerabilities. The interrogation of Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, chief cryptanalyst of WWII, provided remarkable insights into German thinking that had persisted throughout the war. When told by British interrogators that the Allies had been reading Enigma traffic since 1940, his first response was flat disbelief. Impossible. The mathematical complexity is insurmountable. No nation could devote such resources to a single intelligence source. When shown actual decoded messages, German operational orders that had been read at Bletchley Park, his shock was complete and genuine. But this would require thousands of people and resources beyond imagination. This would require treating cryptanalysis as a military priority equal to building aircraft carriers or training divisions. When interrogators explained the scale of Bletchley Park's operation, the 9,000 personnel, the industrial organization, the electronic computing machines, Hüttenhain's response revealed the conceptual gap that had protected Ultra throughout the war. We calculated that breaking Enigma would require more resources than any rational nation would devote to cryptanalysis. We never imagined you would treat it as a strategic priority equivalent to weapons production. We thought intelligence services operated within reasonable budgetary constraints, not with unlimited resources. Wilhelm Trano, the brilliant B-Dienst cryptanalyst who had broken British convoy codes and provided the intelligence that positioned German wolfpacks, was equally stunned during his TICOM interrogation. He admitted with remarkable candor, "We knew something was wrong throughout 1943 and 44. Too many coincidences, too many lucky discoveries by the Allies, too many impossible successes. But whenever I suggested cryptographic compromise in staff discussions, I was told I was being paranoid, that I was showing defeatist thinking. Breaking Enigma was a mathematical impossibility according to our experts. Questioning this was treated as questioning established scientific fact. The interrogation of lower-level personnel revealed widespread suspicions that had been systematically suppressed throughout the command chain. Radio operators reported that they had noticed patterns suggesting Allied foreknowledge, that certain types of messages seemed to trigger immediate enemy responses. U-boat commanders had questioned in private conversations how convoys always seemed to zigzag at the perfect moment to avoid attack positions. Intelligence analysts had documented statistical impossibilities in Allied success rates that couldn't be explained by technology or resources alone. But at every level, from radio operators to senior staff officers, these concerns had been dismissed with the same response that had become a mantra. Enigma cannot be broken. Our cryptographic experts have proven this mathematically. Perhaps most revealing was the interrogation of Korvettenkapitän Heinz Bonatz, former head of B-Dienst, who had spent the war reading enemy codes while his own remained compromised. When told about Ultra's scope and longevity, he sat in silence for several minutes before responding, and his words captured the essence of Germany's intelligence catastrophe. Then we never had a chance after 1941. From the moment you broke Enigma systematically, the war was lost at the strategic level. Everything else, all the battles, all the tactics, all the sacrifices, was just delaying the inevitable. We were fighting blind against an enemy who could see everything we did. The ultra-secret remained protected by the Official Secrets Act until 1974, creating one of the most successful security operations in intelligence history. Over 10,000 people who had worked at Bletchley Park maintained absolute silence for nearly 3 decades, an achievement that speaks to both the effectiveness of British security culture and the seriousness with which these individuals took their oaths. They returned to civilian life in 1945, unable to explain gaps in their employment history, forbidden from discussing their wartime service even with spouses and children, forced to listen to incorrect historical accounts of the war without correction or comment. The temptation to reveal their role, to claim credit for contributions that helped win the war, must have been enormous, yet the silence held with remarkable completeness. The secret's preservation served multiple purposes that justified this burden. During the immediate post-war period, British and American intelligence services were using captured Enigma machines to establish secure communications with developing nations who believed they were receiving state-of-the-art encryption technology, unaware that the Western powers could read everything encrypted with these machines. More importantly, the techniques developed at Bletchley Park were being applied to Soviet communications during the Cold War, and revealing these capabilities would have compromised ongoing operations against the new adversary. The human cost of this enforced silence was significant and lasted for decades. Brilliant cryptanalysts returned to academic positions without recognition for their groundbreaking work in computer science and mathematics. Women who had operated the bombs and Colossus machines, performing work that laid foundations for the computer age, were unable to claim their place in technological history. Veterans who had served at Bletchley Park faced skepticism about their war service from those who didn't understand why healthy young people had spent the war at a country estate, rather than in uniform at the front. Unable to provide details about their contributions, they sometimes faced unspoken accusations of having avoided real service. Gordon Welchman, who had developed the diagonal board modification that made the bomb machines truly effective and had organized Hut 6's operations with remarkable efficiency, immigrated to the United States after the war and worked in classified research. When he finally published his memoir, The Hut 6 Story, in 1982, 8 years after the general declassification of Ultra, he faced threats of prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, despite the war having ended 37 years earlier. British intelligence officials argued that he had revealed operational details that remained classified and could compromise current systems. He died in 1985, finally able to claim credit for innovations that had helped win the war, but facing official censure for revealing details the government wanted to remain secret forever. The dam finally broke in 1974 when Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham published The Ultra Secret. Winterbotham, who had overseen the special liaison units that distributed Ultra intelligence and had fought bureaucratic battles to ensure proper security throughout the war, had fought for years to tell the story. His motivations were complex and deeply personal, a desire for personal vindication after decades of enforced silence, concern for historical accuracy as incorrect accounts of the war proliferated, and genuine worry that crucial lessons about intelligence and warfare were being lost because the full story couldn't be told. The book's publication on November 14, 1974, sent shockwaves through the historical community and surviving German military leadership. Historians suddenly had to revise their entire understanding of World War II campaigns and battles. Accounts of military operations that had been attributed to brilliant generalship or lucky reconnaissance were revealed as intelligence operations based on decoded enemy communications. Allied commanders who had seemed prescient were shown to have been reading their opponent's orders before those orders were executed. For German veterans, the revelation was psychologically devastating in ways that may be difficult for those who didn't experience it to fully understand. General Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter force, who had spent the war wondering why Allied bombers always seemed to avoid his strongest fighter concentrations, reportedly said, after reading Winterbotham's book, "For 30 years, I have been wondering how the Allies always seemed to know where we would be, how they anticipated our every tactical innovation. Now I know they were reading our orders before we were, that every innovation was compromised before it could take effect. The war suddenly makes sense in ways it never did before." Admiral Dönitz's reaction was particularly complex and psychologically revealing. In his hastily written response to Winterbotham's publisher, he claimed to have always suspected communications compromise, that the evidence had been clear to him throughout the war. But this claim contradicted his own war diary entries, his post-war memoirs published in 1958. and the testimony of subordinates who confirmed his absolute faith in Enigma throughout the conflict. The psychological need to retroactively claim suspicion revealed the depth of the wound to professional pride. To admit he had been completely blind to the compromise would mean acknowledging that his entire strategic approach had been fundamentally flawed, that 30,000 men had died because of his misplaced confidence in communications security. The most dramatic confrontation with the truth came at a 1978 intelligence history conference in Germany, where former adversaries met publicly for the first time to discuss the war's intelligence operations. The conference, hosted by the German Marine Institute in a spirit of historical inquiry, brought together British cryptanalysts from Bletchley Park and German intelligence officers who had operated Enigma systems. The atmosphere was tense, charged with emotions that had been suppressed for over 3 decades. The keynote session featured Harry Hinsley, former Bletchley Park analyst and official historian of British intelligence in the war, facing Wilhelm Tranow and other B-Dienst veterans across a conference table. Hinsley's presentation methodically destroyed every German assumption about their wartime security, walking through the breaking of Enigma from the Polish breakthrough to the Bletchley Park industrialization to specific operational examples. He showed decoded messages, explained cryptanalytic techniques in detail, revealed the scale of Allied code-breaking operations, and discussed how intelligence had been used to shape major campaigns. The German response mixed professional admiration for the cryptanalytic achievement with personal devastation at the implications. Tranow, maintaining his professional composure, asked technical questions about British methods, clearly impressed by the mathematical elegance of the attacks and the organizational sophistication. But when discussion turned to operational consequences, when the conversation shifted from abstract cryptanalysis to the reality of men dying because their orders had been read, emotions erupted in ways that conference organizers hadn't anticipated. The most heated exchange came when Otto Kretschmer, Germany's most successful U-boat commander, who had been captured in 1941 and spent the war as a prisoner, confronted former Dönitz staff officers who were still defending their wartime decisions. When they presented what they called the steamroller theory, arguing that German strategy had been designed to force the Allies to commit maximum resources to the Atlantic, regardless of tactical outcomes, that U-boat losses had served strategic purposes even in defeat, Kretschmer exploded with anger that had been building for 37 years. "Steamroller," he shouted, standing up so forcefully that his chair fell backward. "We were sending men to their deaths in operations the enemy knew about in advance. Every patrol order, every tactical innovation, every desperate attempt to turn the tide, they knew it all before we did. And you still defend this as strategy. You still claim there was some higher purpose to sending 30,000 men to die in a battle that was lost before it began?" The confrontation nearly became physical before conference organizers intervened, but Kretschmer's outburst voiced what many German veterans felt. They had been betrayed, not by enemies who fought brilliantly, but by their own leadership's refusal to consider the possibility of cryptographic compromise, even when evidence pointed clearly in that direction. In the years following Ultra's revelation, German cryptographers conducted extensive post-mortems on Enigma's failure, analyzing what had gone wrong both technically and institutionally. What they discovered was both reassuring and deeply disturbing. The system itself remained mathematically sound in its fundamental design. The encryption algorithm was strong, but human implementation had created fatal vulnerabilities that no amount of mathematical sophistication could overcome. The Polish breakthrough in 1932 had exploited a procedural weakness that seemed minor at the time. The Germans transmitted the message key indicator twice at the beginning of each message. Redundancy intended to ensure accurate reception that provided the mathematical relationship allowing Marian Rejewski to reconstruct Enigma's internal wiring using permutation group theory. By the time Germans eliminated this practice in May 1940, the Poles had already shared their knowledge with British and French intelligence. The British success built on Polish foundations, but required massive technological innovation that the Germans never imagined. The bomb machines designed by Turing and Welchman, exploited the fact that no letter could encode to itself, a fundamental characteristic of Enigma's reflector design. By testing possible rotor positions against known or guessed plaintext, cribs derived from predictable message formats and operator mistakes, the bombs could eliminate impossible settings at electronic speeds that made comprehensive daily breaking practical. German security procedures, though elaborate on paper, actually aided British cryptanalysis through their very predictability. The prohibition on repeating rotor positions for consecutive days meant British cryptanalysts could eliminate yesterday's settings from consideration, reducing the search space. Strict formatting requirements for military messages provided predictable cribs. Weather reports always began with the same phrases. Supply requests followed standard formats. Daily situation reports contained repetitive elements that appeared in message after message. Most damningly, German confidence in Enigma led to poor operational security in ways that had nothing to do with the machine itself. Messages were transmitted containing information that appeared in other less secure communications, providing cribs that made breaking possible. When B-Dienst broke British convoy codes, German U-boat headquarters would transmit British convoy positions through Enigma, providing perfect cribs for British cryptanalysts who knew their own convoy locations and could use that knowledge to reconstruct the encryption. The system's failure was fundamentally human rather than mathematical, a failure of imagination and institutional culture rather than technical design. Military historians have spent decades since 1974 analyzing Ultra's impact on World War II's outcome, and the scholarly consensus has solidified around assessments that emphasize its decisive strategic importance. Sir Harry Hinsley's official assessment that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years, and possibly 4, has become the accepted view among serious historians. But the implications go far beyond simple temporal calculations. Ultra fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in ways that would influence intelligence operations for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. For the first time in history, one side could consistently read its opponent's most secret communications in near real time, creating what amounted to strategic omniscience. This wasn't merely tactical advantage of the kind that spies and scouts had provided throughout military history. It was the ability to see the enemy's strategic thinking, to understand their assessment of the situation, to anticipate their responses to your own moves. Every major German offensive from 1941 onwards faced opponents who knew their plans, strength, and often specific objectives days or weeks in advance. The Battle of the Atlantic provides the clearest measure of Ultra's impact in ways that can be quantified. Historians calculate that Ultra intelligence saved between 300 and 500 merchant ships through convoy rerouting, approximately 1.5 to 2 million tons of shipping. Without preventing these losses, Britain would have faced starvation by mid-1941, possibly forcing surrender or negotiated peace. The ability to route convoys around wolfpacks, made possible by knowing U-boat positions from decoded messages, meant the difference between British survival and German victory in the campaign that both sides recognized as strategically decisive. In North Africa, Ultra intelligence allowed Montgomery to fight the Second Battle of El Alamein with perfect knowledge of Rommel's plans, strength, and supply situation. He positioned his forces exactly where Rommel intended to attack, creating killing fields that destroyed German armor before it could maneuver effectively. At Alam Halfa in August-September 1942, Montgomery knew German fuel supplies, tank strength, and Rommel's specific tactical plan down to individual unit movements. The Normandy invasion succeeded partly because Ultra revealed exactly what German commanders believed about Allied intentions. Every German intelligence assessment concluding the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy was read by Allied planners who adjusted their deception operations accordingly, reinforcing German misconceptions. German reinforcement orders after D-Day were known before local commanders received them, allowing Allied air forces to interdict movement before German units could reach the front. The most tragic aspect of German ignorance about Ultra, the human dimension that transcends strategic calculations, was the human cost paid by those who never knew they were doomed by intelligence failure. Hundreds of thousands of German servicemen died in operations that were compromised before they began because their orders had been decoded. U-boat crews suffered the highest proportional losses of any German service. 75% casualties among the 40,000 men who served in submarines, men who sailed into battles where Allied forces knew their exact positions, their fuel states, their torpedo loadings, and their intended targets. They fought with incredible bravery against impossible odds, never knowing the odds were impossible because their enemies could read their mail and position forces accordingly. Luftwaffe pilots flew into ambushes prepared days in advance based on decoded operational orders. Transport aircraft carrying desperately needed supplies to encircled forces were intercepted with such regularity that crews called themselves flying coffins, never knowing that their routes had been revealed by decoded messages. Fighter units found Allied bombers consistently avoiding their patrol areas while striking undefended targets, not through lucky reconnaissance as they believed, but through decoded deployment orders that revealed defensive dispositions. Wehrmacht soldiers fought battles where their opponents knew their strength, their objectives, and often their exact timing of attack. The destruction of entire divisions in Tunisia, the collapse of carefully prepared defensive lines in Italy, the failure of every major counteroffensive from Kursk to the Ardennes, all were influenced by Allied foreknowledge through Ultra. For German military professionals who learned about Ultra in 1974 and afterward, the psychological impact was profound and lasting. Their entire understanding of the war required fundamental revision. Defeats attributed to material inferiority or tactical errors were revealed as intelligence failures at the highest level. Heroes who had died making desperate attacks had been sailing or flying into traps prepared by enemies reading their orders. General Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of blitzkrieg warfare who revolutionized armored operations, wrote in a private letter discovered after his death, "Learning about Ultra was like discovering your entire life was a stage play where everyone knew the script except you. Every decision I made, every order I gave, every plan I developed, the enemy knew it all. We were not generals commanding armies in the traditional sense. We were actors performing for an audience that knew our every line, that could anticipate our every move." For Admiral Dönitz, who lived until 1980, the revelation colored his final years in ways that family members and associates found painful to witness. He became increasingly withdrawn, according to those who knew him, spending hours recalculating old battles with the new knowledge that his communications had been compromised, trying to understand what different decisions he might have made had he known the truth. His final manuscript, never published and reportedly destroyed after his death at his family's request, contained extensive revisions to his understanding of the U-boat war, acknowledging that no amount of submarines or tactical innovation could have succeeded against an enemy reading every order, that the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost at the strategic level the moment Bletchley Park achieved consistent breaks into naval Enigma. The psychological impact extended beyond military leaders to ordinary veterans trying to make sense of their wartime experiences. U-boat survivors formed support groups in the 1980s to process the knowledge that their service had been doomed by communications intelligence rather than military failure, that their friends had died not because they made mistakes or lacked courage, but because the enemy knew where they would be. Luftwaffe pilots revised their understanding of why they had been consistently outnumbered at crucial interception points, why bomber streams always seemed to avoid the strongest defensive concentrations. Wehrmacht veterans realized their sacrifices had been magnified by intelligence failures at the highest levels, failures they had no ability to detect or prevent. The children and grandchildren of German World War II veterans faced their own reckoning with Ultra's revelation, struggling to reconcile family narratives with historical reality. Many had grown up with stories of heroic sacrifice against overwhelming odds, tales of courage and skill in desperate circumstances. Learning that their relatives had been systematically deceived by failures at the highest levels of German intelligence created complex emotional responses that mixed pride in individual courage with anger at institutional blindness. Hans-Peter Dönitz, the Admiral's grandson, wrote in his 2003 memoir, My grandfather went to his grave in 1980, believing he had done everything humanly possible to win the Battle of the Atlantic. That defeat came from material inferiority rather than strategic failure. Learning about Ultra forced our family to confront a different narrative, one where his greatest innovation, centralized control through radio communication, became the primary instrument of his fleet's destruction. He was not a fool. He was an intelligent, capable officer, but he was fooled by his own certainty, by assumptions so deeply embedded they became invisible. The German failure to detect Enigma's compromise offers profound lessons about institutional blindness and the dangers of absolute certainty that remain relevant today. The Wehrmacht's investigation apparatus was sophisticated, thorough, and staffed by intelligent, dedicated professionals who took security seriously. Yet they failed completely because they couldn't question fundamental assumptions that had become institutional dogma. Every investigation started with the premise that Enigma was secure, that this had been proven mathematically and therefore couldn't be questioned. Evidence was interpreted through this lens, with alternative explanations forced to fit predetermined conclusions, no matter how implausible those explanations became. When multiple supply ships were destroyed at remote coordinates, investigators looked for spies, improved radar, systematic reconnaissance patterns, anything except communications compromise. When convoys consistently evaded wolfpacks with impossible precision, they blamed Allied air coverage, rather than questioning whether patrol positions were known in advance. The compartmentalization that protected Enigma operations also prevented comprehensive security analysis. Cryptographers assured operators the system was unbreakable through mathematical proof. Operators assured commanders that procedures were properly followed. Commanders assured high command that security was maintained. Nobody had responsibility for questioning the entire system from first principles, and anybody who did faced institutional pressure to conform to established views. German technical pride became a vulnerability rather than an asset. The belief that German engineering and mathematics were superior to Allied capabilities created blind spots that prevented objective analysis. When evidence suggested otherwise, when convoys evaded with impossible precision or supply ships were caught at remote coordinates, the response was to look for even more complex explanations rather than accept that the Allies might have superior cryptanalytic capabilities. Throughout the war, Germans received warnings they consistently dismissed or misinterpreted, each representing an opportunity to discover the truth that institutional blindness prevented them from seeing. In February 1942, the German naval attaché in Tokyo reported that the American Navy seemed to have foreknowledge of Japanese operations in the Pacific. The Germans dismissed this as Japanese excuse-making for their defeats, never considering that if Americans were reading Japanese codes, which they were through the Magic program, they might also be reading German ones. Swiss intelligence warnings in August 1943 were explicit. German naval codes were compromised and being read currently. The German response was to investigate the source of Swiss information rather than the substance of their warning, concluding the Swiss had been fed disinformation by Allied intelligence, rather than accepting that neutral observers had noticed obvious patterns. Even within German intelligence services, suspicions were systematically suppressed through institutional pressure. When B-Dienst analyst Lieutenant Friedrich noted statistical impossibilities in convoy routing patterns that suggested foreknowledge, his report was buried with a dismissive note that mathematical analysis alone cannot determine intelligence sources. When U-boat commanders reported that convoys seemed to anticipate their positions, they were told to maintain better radio discipline rather than question whether their messages were secure. The greatest irony of the Enigma story lies in B-Dienst's success breaking Allied codes. While Germany remained blind to Enigma's compromise, B-Dienst successfully broke numerous Allied codes throughout the war, reading British convoy codes, American diplomatic traffic, and Soviet military communications. This success should have taught them that codes could be broken, that communication security was always vulnerable, that cryptanalytic success was possible with sufficient resources and determination. Instead, their success reinforced their blindness in a tragic paradox. German cryptanalysts knew intimately how difficult codebreaking was, how many resources it required, how often attempts failed. They projected their own limitations onto the Allies, assuming that if Germany struggled to break Allied codes despite massive effort, the Allies must face even greater challenges attacking the supposedly superior Enigma system. Wilhelm Trano's success reading British convoy codes convinced him he understood the limits of cryptanalysis. He knew that even with captured codebooks, maintaining continuous access required constant effort and frequent failure when codes changed. He couldn't imagine the Allies had industrialized the process, turning cryptanalysis from art to science, from individual genius to mass production in a factory-like environment. Dienst's tactical successes ultimately contributed to strategic failure, in ways that became clear only after Ultra's revelation. Reading convoy codes allowed precise positioning of wolfpacks, but these positions were then transmitted through Enigma to U-boats, providing perfect cribs for Bletchley Park analysts who knew British convoy positions and could use that knowledge to reconstruct German encryption. German tactical intelligence victories accelerated their strategic intelligence defeat, creating a feedback loop that they never detected. The story of German blindness to Enigma's compromise offers timeless warnings about the dangers of absolute certainty in intelligence and security matters that remain relevant in our modern age of cyber warfare and electronic surveillance. It demonstrates how competent, intelligent professionals can miss obvious truths when institutional blindness reinforces comfortable assumptions that serve psychological needs. Modern intelligence services worldwide study the Enigma failure as a cautionary tale about cognitive bias and the dangers of certainty. The US National Security Agency includes it in training programs about security assumptions and the importance of challenging fundamental premises. The British GCHQ uses it to teach analysts the necessity of questioning systems regardless of mathematical proofs. Military academies worldwide analyze it as the supreme example of intelligence failure, despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. The German failure wasn't fundamentally technological, though technology played a role. Their cryptographic mathematics were sound and the machines well designed. It wasn't procedural, though procedures could have been better. Their security protocols were elaborate and generally well executed compared to other nations. It wasn't intellectual or a matter of insufficient intelligence. German cryptanalysts were among the world's best trained professionals who understood their field deeply. The failure was psychological and institutional at its core, the inability to question fundamental assumptions despite mounting evidence they were catastrophically wrong. In our modern age of cyber warfare, electronic surveillance and digital encryption, the Enigma story carries renewed relevance for anyone responsible for security. Every system assumed secure, every communication believed private, every encryption considered unbreakable, should be questioned with the knowledge that somewhere, someone may be reading what was meant to be secret. That technological certainty can blind us to operational reality. In 1979, 5 years after Ultra's revelation and 1 year before his death, Admiral Karl Dönitz gave his final interview about the intelligence failure that had destroyed his U-boat fleet and, in his view, cost Germany victory in World War II. Aged 88, the last Führer of the Third Reich had spent 5 years wrestling privately with the knowledge that his every command had been transparent to his enemies, that 30,000 men had died following orders the British read before U-boat commanders received them. "You ask if I suspected," he said to the interviewer, his voice still carrying traces of the Prussian military authority that had commanded respect and obedience. "Of course I suspected something was wrong. We all suspected the enemy had advantages we didn't fully understand. But suspicion and knowledge are fundamentally different things. To suspect the enemy has intelligence advantages is military prudence, normal caution. To know your every thought is revealed to him, that he reads your orders as you write them, is something else entirely. That way lies madness." He paused, looking out the window of his Aumühle apartment at the peaceful German countryside, so utterly different from the Atlantic battleground, where his men had fought and died in a losing battle they never understood. Could we have won if we had known the truth about Enigma? No. By the time it was thoroughly broken in 1941, the war's ultimate outcome was probably determined by material factors. But we might have lost differently with different tactics. We might have saved thousands of lives by changing our approach, by accepting defensive positions, by acknowledging reality instead of fighting phantoms we couldn't understand. The greatest tragedy, he continued, his voice heavy with the weight of years and bitter knowledge, was not that we lost, but that we never knew why we were losing in real time. We blamed technology we didn't possess, resources we couldn't match, air power we couldn't counter, everything except the truth that was too painful to accept. 30,000 of my men died in submarines, many in operations the enemy knew about before my commanders received their orders. They died bravely, with discipline and courage, fighting an enemy who could read our thoughts through broken codes. That is the burden I carry. His final words on Ultra, recorded in that interview, carried the weight of bitter experience earned across decades. In war, the greatest enemy is not the opposing force with their weapons and strategy. It is your own certainty, your unshakable conviction that certain things are impossible. We were absolutely certain Enigma was secure. That certainty, more than all the depth charges and aircraft in the Allied arsenal, killed my men and lost the battle that might have won the war. Today, Bletchley Park stands as a museum dedicated to one of history's greatest intelligence triumphs and Germany's greatest intelligence failure. A place where visitors can walk through history. The huts where young men and women broke the unbreakable cipher are preserved and restored. The bomb machines have been reconstructed with painstaking accuracy. The story is finally told after decades of enforced silence. Visitors walk through spaces where mathematical genius combined with industrial organization to achieve what German experts considered computationally impossible. They see the cramped conditions where thousands worked in absolute secrecy, knowing they held war-winning intelligence but unable to speak of it even to family members sleeping in the same house. They learn how an eccentric collection of mathematicians, linguists, chess players, and crossword puzzle enthusiasts industrialized cryptanalysis and changed warfare forever, creating the foundations of the modern computing age. But perhaps the most powerful exhibit is the simplest and most direct. An actual four-rotor naval Enigma machine, captured from U-505 in June 1944 and displayed in working condition, sits behind glass where visitors can see it up close. Some museums allow visitors to encode messages on replica machines, watching the rotors turn and lights illuminate, experiencing the same mechanical precision that convinced German cryptographers of absolute security. They can understand viscerally how something so complex, so mathematically sophisticated, so carefully protected by elaborate security procedures, could still be broken by determined enemies with sufficient resources, imagination, and willingness to industrialize what had previously been considered an art form, requiring individual genius. The machine stands as a monument to a simple but profound truth in intelligence, in warfare, and in life itself. The greatest danger comes not from what we don't know, but from what we're certain we know that proves to be catastrophically wrong. The Germans were certain Enigma was secure, certain with mathematical proofs and expert assessments and institutional consensus. That certainty, more than any Allied weapon, strategy, or material advantage, ensured their defeat in the intelligence war that shaped military outcomes. In the guest book at Bletchley Park, among thousands of entries from visitors worldwide expressing amazement and gratitude, one entry stands out for its poignancy and historical significance. Written in neat German script in 1995 by someone who signed only as a German grandson, it reads, "My grandfather commanded U-604, lost with all hands in August 1943 in the Atlantic. For 50 years our family believed he died fighting overwhelming Allied technology, that his sacrifice was heroic defeat against impossible odds. Now I know he died because his orders were read by enemies before he received them, that every move was known in advance. The tragedy is not that Germany lost the war. The tragedy is that we never knew we had already lost the intelligence war that determined everything else. The heroes of Bletchley Park deserve our respect for their brilliance and their long silence, but the lesson of Enigma deserves our constant remembrance. Certainty is the most dangerous enemy. The story of how Germans never knew the Allies had cracked Enigma is ultimately a story about the fragility of certainty, the danger of institutional blindness, and the devastating cost of refusing to question fundamental assumptions even when evidence demands it. It reminds us that in intelligence, in warfare, and in life, the most dangerous enemy is often our own unexamined certainty about what we know to be true. The 30,000 German submariners who died beneath the Atlantic waves, the thousands of Luftwaffe pilots shot from skies where enemies knew they would be, the Wehrmacht soldiers who fought battles orchestrated by opponents reading their orders, all were victims not just of war, but of an intelligence failure so complete that it remained hidden from those who most desperately needed to know it. The secret of Ultra was kept for 30 years after the war ended, an achievement of operational security that remains unmatched. But the greater secret, the deeper lesson that transcends World War II history, is how German certainty in their security blinded them to obvious compromise visible to neutral observers. This offers lessons that remain profoundly relevant as long as nations keep secrets and assume their communications are secure. The Enigma machine, once the pride of German cryptographic ingenuity and technical excellence, now stands in museums as history's greatest monument to the danger of absolute certainty in an uncertain world. The Germans never knew their communications were compromised. That ignorance, maintained despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, represents one of history's most consequential intelligence failures and one of its most important lessons. In the end, the Allies didn't just break Enigma through mathematical brilliance and technological innovation. They broke it while maintaining such perfect secrecy that their enemies never suspected their most secret thoughts were an open book, that every strategic decision was made with full knowledge of German intentions. That achievement, preserved through the disciplined silence of thousands and the careful choreography of deception operations, stands as perhaps the greatest intelligence victory in the history of warfare. The story ends where it began, with an old admiral in 1974 holding a book that revealed truths that destroyed everything he had believed about why he lost the war he had dedicated his life to winning. Karl Dönitz's stunned silence that June afternoon was not just for the men he had lost, or the war that had been doomed from the moment Enigma was systematically broken. It was the silence of recognition that certainty itself had been the enemy, that mathematical confidence had become a fatal vulnerability, that the unbreakable cipher had been broken, while those who depended on it remained blind to the catastrophe unfolding in the shadows. That silence, that moment of terrible recognition, speaks across the decades to anyone responsible for security in any form. Question everything, assume nothing, and remember that certainty is often the most dangerous illusion of all.